I must say I gladly accepted the invitation to speak, to open the conference on the subject, even though it seems that there is an inherent danger in speaking about the subject with a capital S, as Anna said, in general, since in French political thought, no subject seems to have been as overdone as the subject, or the subject of the subject. And I'm going to stop this French thing in a few seconds, but speaking about the subject does subject you to a dialogue with a very long, rich, and I would say almost overwhelming tradition of philosophical thought. So I'm going to try to, maybe stay a little away from that, but still I have to start with this tradition. From Rousseau and Sieyès to Foucault and Balibar, a very long intellectual trajectory has put the relation between the subject and the citizen, or put differently, that between the processes of subjugation and subjectivation, and here obviously I'm using the vocabulary of Michel Foucault, at the center of an analysis of politics and power. So, as you recall, in The Social Contract, in Book 1, Chapter 6, Jean-Jacques Rousseau defined the social compact at, I'm going to speak in French, maybe I put all the quotations in French and English, so cette personne publique qui se forme ainsi par l'union de toutes les autres. And that's an occasion for him to define the couplet of subject and citizens, because he says, à l'égard des associés, ils prennent collectivement le nom de peuple et s'appellent en particulier citoyens, comme participant à l'autorité souveraine, et sujet, comme soumis à la loi de l'État. Mais ces termes se confondent souvent et se prennent l'un pour l'autre. Il suffit de les savoir distinguer quand ils sont employés dans toute leur précision. So the confusion is between citizen and subject. And he has a note actually after that. He has a note to say that French people don't understand the distinction between citizen and subject, he's there to correct that. So for Rousseau, of course, the distinction is clear. The formation of the social contract, instituting civil liberty in place of natural liberty, produces the Janus figure of the citizen subject. That is, of a citizen who is a citizen only insofar as he is also subject of the laws he has devised as a member of the sovereign. As Balibar noted in his work on the citizen subject, the citoyen sujet, this duality might well appear as the two faces of the same medal in Rousseau's work. But in reality, it takes the form of a historical process. As Balibar explained at length in the same room this past fall, the citizen comes after the subject, not only logically but historically. In the French tradition, with the Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen in 1789, which was obviously marked the advance of the citizen in public sphere. And for Balibar, this succession in time reflects also a conceptual décalage, not only an historical succession, but also a conceptual décalage between the two faces of the medal, which opens up the possibility of divergence between citizen and subject, even though one remains unthinkable without the other. And, as Balibar insists, this conceptual articulation between citizen and subject derives from the inherent dualism of the notion of subject, both in French and in English, as, coming from the Latin, as subjectum and subjectus. That is, on one hand, the autonomous subject, the subject that gives himself his own rule from the inside, so to speak, and the one that is subjected to an external power. As you will also recall, I think, in his own way, Michel Foucault's reflection on the subject and power elaborates on this tradition. Not by analyzing the relationship between the subject and citizen actually no status, no place in Foucault's intellectual project, but by scrutinizing the articulation between the process of subjection, assujettissement, and formation of subjectivity, subjectivation. Again, in Foucault's thought, this articulation comes explicitly from the double meaning of the word subject. So here you have quote from Michel Foucault in Subject and Power, where he says, speaks about the power of subjectivation, and he says, il y a deux sens, at the end of the quotation, il y a deux sens au mot sujet, sujet soumis à l'autre par le contrôle et la dépendance, et sujet attaché à sa propre identité par la conscience ou la connaissance de soi. Dans les deux cas, ce mot suggère une forme de pouvoir qui subjugue et assujettit. I will not elaborate here on the extremely rich philosophical literature that has explored this insight in the past 30 years and ask how one could problematize, maybe more than Foucault ever did, the relationship between dependence and subjectivity, or between control and agency. As Judge Berger put it in The Psychic Life of Power, the question has been for the past 30 years, I think, how can it be that the subject, taken to be the condition for an instrument of agency, is at the same time the effect of subordination, understood as the deprivation of agency? The reason I won't develop this line of thought on the tension inherent in the notion of the subject, whether in the form of its relationship to the citizen or in the form of the couplet of subjection and subjectivation, is that in the end, it is of very little help to me as an historian of colonialism. In particular, it does not contribute much to the understanding of the making of the colonial subject in the context of modern French colonial empire, the modern French colonial empire, which is conventionally said to start in 1830 with the seizure of Algeria. There are several reasons for this lack of relevance. First and foremost, what characterizes the status of colonial subjects is the form of absolute subjection, if you want. There was no becoming citizen for the native populations of the empire, no second phase of the medal, nothing after the subject. In the French territories, starting with Algeria and then in other places, there was instead a long and complex process of definition of the status of native populations as entirely deprived of political rights and civil liberties and not enjoying equality before the law. In addition, if we go back to the Foucault's couplet of assujettissement and subjectivation, it is quite obvious that this, the assujettissement, the subjugation of the natives, did not correlate with a form of subjectivation in the sense of, used by Foucault, of the conscious and self-knowledge that was that would be the result of this process of subjectivation. So no correlation between those two processes. If natives were indeed tied, as Foucault said in the English version, I underline this, if the natives were actually tied to their own identities by a conscious of self-knowledge, which is an open question, which is not at all an obvious question to ask, it was by using a very different set of cultural tools. To a great extent then, and I'm sure nobody is very much surprised here, the empire, the French empire at least, appears as a space where some of the most central concepts of Western political thought are inoperative. It appears as a political set that is space that is radically different and calls for different analysis of how power is exercised. In the history of anti-colonial movements, one common reaction to this incommensurability of the imperial space has been to characterize the colonial situation as a regressive form, as a place where political modernity did not take hold. If the citizen does indeed come after the subject in the French tradition, let's say in the Russian tradition, then the colonial situation should be characterized as a form of feudalism, as a pre-modern political space, as has been done repeatedly by anti-colonial militants in the first half of the 20th century, and most forcefully by people like Ferhat Abbas in Algeria, whose manifesto for the Algerian people in 1943 called for a true revolution using the rhetoric of the French Revolution that would establish liberty and equality of all inhabitants. This description of the political space, the imperial political space, as feudal, as pre-modern, has been accepted actually by several historians, but it is, in my view, not entirely satisfying or deeply unsatisfying. First, because it is at odds with the intimate connections between imperialism and capitalism, which militants like Abbas, by the way, also underline. It also ignores that colonial spaces have served, sometimes, as laboratory of many forms of modern governmentality in domains as varied as imperialism, population control, health policies, and criminalization. Finally, portraying the empire as a space for feudal power, where native populations would be subjected to a sovereign, absolute, and arbitrary power, in a very similar way as the subjects of the French king were before the Revolution, misses several important points about how imperial power was exercised, at least in the French context. One of them, most relevant, I think, to this year's conference, is the very absence of the subject from legal discourse. By this, I mean that, at least in the Algerian case, in which I've worked quite a lot in the past few years, the word subject is often used in political and military discourses, but never appears in legal texts to refer to individuals subjected to colonial domination. In some ways, it is clear that the subject that is referred to in colonial political discourse is a legal status. After all, it refers to people who are deprived of any rights. But again, the word itself doesn't appear in legal text, and that's the enigma that I think is worth thinking about. Nowhere, then, can one find the legal definition of a subject. And the usage of the word is almost absent, at least until the beginning of the 20th century, when it will be used not to denote subjection, but in a very neutralized way, as a concept of public international law, to designate all the people who, as inhabitants of the French empires, are subject to French sovereignty. So, as a form of quasi-nationality in relationship to other, mostly to other empires, actually. In addition to this lacuna, or maybe to this impossibility to articulate subjection in law, the other legal categories that have been used as proxies for the notion of subject were often unstable and ambiguous in French colonial law. The most common, of course, was the category of indigène, that is native, which far from being the finished product of the Orientalist imagination before 1830, was actually, and that's one of the things that interests me, was the result of a slow and complex process of qualification on the ground in the catastrophic context of the conquest and its immediate aftermath. In 1830, and for many years afterwards, legal texts used multiple categories to describe the inhabitants of Algeria. Alongside the general category of categories of inhabitant or natural born, the naturel, there were a plethora of religious, political, ethnic, and sometimes national designations such as Turk, Moorish, Mamluk, Muslim, Israelite, and Arab. The latter category, the category of Arab, appeared in legal texts in the 1840s to describe property, land, and slaves. Progressively, again, I'm here speaking only about legal text, the word Arab was exclusively used to refer to material things in law. Starting in the 1850s, French colonial law began to speak of les terres arabes, the Arab lands, or les impôts arabes, the Arab taxes, and not of Arab individuals or Arab people. Starting in the 1860s, so more than 30 years after the beginning of the conquest, after many court decisions and doctrinal debates that were on very concrete situations, such as, for example, the right for a native to be a member of the Algiers bar, citizenship was, or nationality, French nationality, was a requirement to be a lawyer. So in those very concrete situations, a legal vocabulary was worked out and began to acquire a form of stability or an apparent fixity. The words that impose themselves to describe the different groups of populations in Algeria were indigènes, first and foremost, and musulmans, and also Israelites, Israelite, which will disappear after the Décret Crémieux in 1870. And also, obviously, on the other side, Français, citoyens. Starting with the Senatus Consult of 1865, the Senatus Consult is a law that was passed, is a form of the law that was passed during the Second Empire. Starting with the Senatus Consult of 1865, the indigène, here both Muslim and Israelite and Jewish, is defined as a French national deprived of the rights of citizenship. Again, not as a subject. So here you don't have the vocabulary as a subject that appears in French law, but negatively, if you want, the indigène musulman is français, so he's French. He's French. But it continues to be ruled by Muslim law. I'm sorry, Muslim. I did the translation a little fast. It's not wonderful. And so Muslim law, and he can be allowed to enjoy the rights of French citizenship, which will end up being a very long and complex and prohibitively costly process, which means here that, by definition, the Muslim native is French, but he is not a citizen. In order to become a citizen, he has to go through many complex steps. In this very important text, the indigène is said to be French without having the rights of the citizen. Here, French nationality was explicitly divorced from citizenship, at least for males. For the first time since, since, let's say, the Second Republic. Let's note that this dissociation between nationality and citizenship was established by the Second Republic, by the Second Empire. So 1865 is Napoleon III, but will remain in place throughout the Third Republic and up until the Fourth Republic, up until the mid-1940s. But the existence of French people, of a group of French people deprived of civil rights, was going very much against the grain of French Republican culture at the time, so much so that there was a very large degree of incomprehension and misuse of the categories of indigènes and citizens in the last third of the century. Even legislators did not understand this distinction, or it seems to be completely confused. One great example, can be found in the discussion of a petition to the Senate signed by 93 heads of households from the oasis of El Cantara in 1889. This group of Algerians complained that the local administrators had promised a collective tax exemption due to a loss of income after bad weather. Upon receiving the same tax form as usual, they delegated a group to visit the administrators to remind him of his promise. His reaction was to jail them for 5 days and fine them 5 francs, which at the time was quite considerable, which prompted the inhabitants of this oasis to complain to the Senate. In the Republic, there was a very important process of petitioning the Parliament, the Senate, and the National Assembly, which is obviously a fantastic source of, for political historians. And actually, very interestingly, people in all colonies at the time were using that right quite extensively. And there are many petitions from Algerians which I've looked at in the course of this research, which are quite fascinating. So apparently completely ignorant of the legal regime of Algeria, actually more ignorant than you are now that you have read the Senatus Consult of 1865, they indignantly asserted their rights, the rights of their petitioners as citizens. So they're completely indignant about what the administrator did, the senators. They don't understand this étrange abus de pouvoir, and they call those indigènes des citoyens français, completely misreading the Senatus Consult of 1865 by saying, they don't, ils ne jouissent pas des droits politiques, but personne ne doit oublier qu'ils n'en sont pas moins des citoyens français. So it's, I mean, like, I as an historian find this kind of discrepancy between everything you build as, models and as understanding of, how things work, and then you have like very important actors completely confused about distinction that you think are crucial to, how the social and political world work. So it appears. And here I'm not going very much into the details. A lot of people, including myself, have worked on this history in the past, the recent past. It appears that the legal categories of populations were highly contingent, the result of a local history of power relations in Algeria, and the object of much misunderstanding by the metropolitan elites. Here, one could be skeptical, and emphasis nuances the work of a kind of sophistic, or in French we say Jesuistic, that pays way too much attention to semantics, to words. One could be tempted to ask, so what? Did the absence of legal definition of the subject matter in any way? Did the complexity and ambiguities of categories change? Did these complexities and ambiguities change the subjective experience of colonized Algerians? Did they alter the way in which colonial power was exercised? Did this attenuate the violence of the colonial situation, the reality of expropriation and dispossession, the everyday experience of arbitrariness? After all, the colonists knew pretty well how to identify an indigène when it came to extract his resources or exercise domination. So why doing that? I'm not going to answer completely these questions today, but I think to answer this question is to assess the contribution of law to modern colonialism and to try to understand how law, as a discourse, but also as an instance of production of social reality, has shaped colonial situations, including its inherent violence. I will not be able to really fully articulate this today because it's actually at the heart of my future project, which I hope to be able to really work on seriously next year. But as a start, I propose to turn briefly to a legal text, the Code de l'Indigénat, the Native Code, a code of special infractions, infractions spéciales, applicable specifically to the native subjects of the French Empire. Rooted in measures used by the military, the French military, to discipline and punish a resisting population during the period of conquest, and modeled partially after the Code of Naval Justice, the Code of Maritime Naval Justice. This code was drafted in Algeria during the decade following the establishment of civilian rule in 1870. So the idea that in 1870 the bulk of the conquest is finished except for 3/4 of the Algerian territory, which is the Sahara, which is going to go on until 1902. But in 1870 there is a change also because of the change of regime in France from empire to republic, and there is a military rule is officially over in Algeria, and civilian rule replaces military rule, at least in the north, which is the most populated part of Algeria. Yet, the code was part of a larger disciplinary regime, which, since General Bugeaud's 1844 ordinance, included penalties antithetical to French penal principles. So, the code really is being drafted between 1870 and 1880, but the idea that it goes back to a longer history of exceptional law, exceptional disciplinary laws, and to which belong administrative internment, which means that basically natives could be put in jail with no due process, with no prosecution, just arbitrarily put in jail, in disciplinary camps. Collective fines imposed on entire communities, so if there was any rebellion, revolt in any place, the entire village, the entire region sometimes, was fined collectively, which is completely antithetical to the idea of the individualization of law in French penal code, obviously. and the sequestration of land. So one of the big punishments that was imposed collectively, that land was sequestrated and redistributed to the colonies. That was actually, it ended up being the main avenue for transferring land property to settlers in Algeria throughout the 19th century. But the code, which I'm going to explain, tomorrow what it was about, the Code de l'Indigénat per se was conceived after 1870 by the colonial administration as, I quote, the residue of military powers due to the necessities of conquest. So after the military leaves, there is something that is left, there is a residue, and that residue is the Code de l'Indigénat. It became law in Algeria in 1881, that is to say, it became a law passed by the French Parliament, and was subsequently exported to most of the other territories of the French Empire. So, except for what was called the old colonies, the entire empire was under this regime of the Code de l'Indigénat. Because the Code de l'Indigénat was a legal text that both enabled and framed the use of force by colonial administrators, it is a strategic site for understanding the connection between law and violence in imperial formations. It is also an essential realm of memory and lieu de mémoire for the arbitrariness of French colonial rule. As you know, in January 2005, a group of activists in France published the Manifesto of the Natives of the Republic, le Manifeste des Indigènes de la République in Le Monde, one of France's main newspapers. The manifesto denounced the continued legal and social inequities suffered by post-colonial immigrants and their descendants. When riots broke out across France in October and November 2005, some participants also presented themselves as discontented natives. In both circumstances, and that's, I think, the important point, the Code de l'Indigénat was a central point of reference for discussion of the deep-seated mechanisms of discrimination in French society. The memory of the code also persists to this day in the territories formerly or currently under French sovereignty, from Algeria to New Caledonia, from Senegal to Vietnam. It conjures memories of forced labor, travel interdictions, arbitrary condemnations, and routine humiliations. The code was at the heart of what nationalists, including Ferhat Abbas, again from Algeria, and later Jean-Marie Tjibaou from New Caledonia, called the Colonial Night, la nuit coloniale. Applied widely, it shaped the everyday life of colonial subjects. For example, at its highest point in 1883, there were 30,827 condemnations under the Code de l'Indigénat, that is to say 17 for condemnation for 1,000 inhabitants, which is a lot. That's for 1 year. So what is the code? What was the Code de l'Indigénat? The code broke with principles of due process, obviously, and contradicted the basic principles of French penal law affirmed during the Revolution, the separation of judicial and administrative powers. Under the regime of the code, local administrators took charge of investigating crimes, prosecuting and judging cases, and penalizing those found guilty by incarceration, fines, or more and more frequently this time, days of unpaid labor. This breach of the principle of separation of powers was constantly justified by the fact that this principle, this philosophical principle, could not be understood fully by Muslims. For one jurist, whose name is Émile Larcher, and was really one of the main jurists of French Algeria, he wrote the textbook that was edited a billion times after 1903. So for one jurist, this principle, that is the principle of penal law in France, and also the constitutional principles of separation of power, are excellents et nécessaires dans une société parvenue au degré de civilisation de la métropole, mais déplacée et dangereux dans le monde islamique. Pour le musulman, l'autorité est une, elle commande et elle punit, et c'est un signe de faiblesse de la part de celui qui ordonne de ne point réprimer tout manquement à ses ordres. It's a sign of weakness on the part of the one who gives orders not to punish any failure to act on them immediately. So the idea that there is no understanding by Muslims of separation of power, they understand only authority, and that's why you can't apply constitutional principles to the colonial situations. And so those, the code, the regime de l'indigénat, the regime, the native regime, is indispensable to maintain calm and security among the native population. The notion of security, the concept of security is absolutely central to all this literature on indigénat. The indigénat is a condition for the maintenance of security in the colonial world. And because this imperative of security appears constantly at the raison d'être of the code, in a way, the list of penalties, the list of crimes in the code, which I'm going to go to in a minute, really reflects what the French colonial state considered as the condition for colonial order, for security. The range of listed crimes went far beyond the French penal code to include such acts as failure to declare birth or death at the Bureau of Vital Statistics, providing, could not translate the whole thing into English, so here you have it in French, and here I've translated a few things in English, not here. So the failure to declare birth or death to the Bureau of Vital Statistics, providing false information given to the census employees, showing lack of respect toward colonial authorities, or traveling without proper documentation. Here you have, there are in that code of, in the 1888 version, 1888 the first time that all the crimes are listed in the law. Before that, there was a law passed for the first time in 1881, and then there was local decrees by each each préfet in the street department of Algeria with specific crimes. So in 1888, in the very French move toward rationalization and codification, there is a law that is going to list all the crimes. So there are 26. Here you have a few of them. So the two one that I want to insist on is public statements against France and its government. And here in French, in a way, you always have an exposé des motifs. You have a motivation of legal dispositions, and the idea that there is an absolute need to repress all public manifestation of hostility. Only punishment on the spot, directly by the representatives of the government, can achieve this result. So there is, again, very, very heavily, explicitly repressive set of practices here. But at the same time, very bizarre, for us bizarre, but actually belonging to a logical, fitting into a logic of colonial security, things that have to do with living in an isolated habitation. Natives could not, had to live in agglomeration in order to be surveilled. They could not travel, obviously, without a permit. They had to pay taxes, which is something that all citizens have to do too. So I'm going to explain the difference, what it is here in a disciplinary code, and so on and so forth. But again, like failure to declare your marriage or the death of a child, the birth of a child or the death of a member of your family at the Bureau des Affaires Civiles was also a crime for the indigènes. So as you can see, it criminalizes behavior that would be considered only as a misdemeanor when done by a French citizen. And the rationale for that, so for the taxes, for example, I'm going to explain this a little more, is that those actions became political when performed by natives. In 1875, so when the code was drafted in Algeria, and I looked at a fantastic archive of hundreds of reports from local administrators saying what they need, what kind of, what they think should be included in the code, and what they need in order to ensure security in Algeria. So in 1875, when the first version of the code was being written in Algeria, the governor, Chanzy, commented on this article on paying taxes on time. Actually, the first version said you have to pay your taxes on time, by noticing that this article made no sense, as a specific infraction for indigent and for native people, since, I'm quoting, Europeans are no more eager to pay taxes than Algerians. But it finally accepted to consider the belatedness in paying taxes as a crime because, and here's a quote, he was persuaded of doing this by the prefect of Algiers because for the natives, the payment of taxes is a sign of submission. It's one of the most visible external signs of their submission to the governmental authority. In these matters, resistances, tardiness, bad-will, refusals have always been regarded as acts of rebellion that precede more serious disorder. So not paying your taxes or paying your taxes is a sign of allegiance to authority, and if you don't pay your taxes, that's actually for my land. If you don't pay your taxes, you are late in paying your taxes, you are showing, you exhibit a political, you take a political voice in manifesting some form of rebellion against the colonial state. So, in a very fundamental way, the code was a code of political domination. Here one might be tempted to I don't know if I'm going to get in there, but one might be tempted to take from Michel Foucault again and his work on Il faut défendre la société, society must be defended, where he says, speaking about medieval law actually, that laws are, in a way, the traces of former conflicts. He says, I have a quote here, you can find the blood dried in the codes of law, and consequently you can find the infinity of history under the stability of law. You can find the cries of battle under the formalism of law. So law would remain as if a kind of a recording, a trace of all the former battles, of the former conflicts. But he said that in a context in which law is being presented or used, at least by the royal power, as a very much so. I mean, that's part of his point, as belonging to the regime of justice. So it is presented as justice, even though you can see still the blood on the code. Here there is no justice. There is absolutely no pretense at justice. This is clearly and simply a code of domination. And nobody pretended, none of the actors was interested in justice or used the lexicon of justice. On the contrary, the code, which was a law passed and repassed, I'm going to get to that in a minute, over the year by the French Parliament, was widely perceived as contradicting the principle of justice. It was even called a judicial monster by one senator in 1888, when he aptly characterized the law as, I quote, including an enormous exception and giving to administrators judicial powers that were unlimited and almost undefined. So this tension, the monstrosity of the law, was heavily felt by the political elite. The law on indigena in 1881, so the first time it was voted by the French Parliament was in 1881, was considered so exorbitant with respect to French legal principles that it was only voted for 7 years at the time. The idea was that transitory character was alleviating the monstrosity of the law. So it was okay to have that monster if it was not a permanent law. By definition, a law, at least in the French, very much so in the French tradition, as some kind of universal and character, as is there to define things for not eternity, but possibly for, if possible, for as long as possible. The idea of putting a term, there are very, very few laws that have their own terms, their own end is included in the draft of the law. And that indicates this very strong sense of malaise by the French Parliament when it voted the law in 1881. This transitory regime had a long life. The law was voted, passed, and repassed until 1944. So it was a transitory thing that lasted for 60 years, and as I said, defined very much the everyday life of large part of the population. So, what could be be tempted to qualify this juridical monster as outside of the law, as a varnish of legality added to colonial violence, a rhetorical alibi, to mask the constant use of arbitrary colonial power. And this is what many historians of the Code of de l'Indigénat, the Code, have done, from Olivier Le Court-Grandmaison to my dear colleague Greg Mann, with whom I've been in discussion for a while. Greg, who has shown how local administrators use the code to practice a form of constant terror. He gives the example, the fascinating example of a commandant de cercle in Mali, forcing the residents of a river to beat the water for nights in a row in order to silence the frogs who were disturbing his sleep. And those who were not doing that were subjected to the Code de l'Indigénat. So it seems like the place for total arbitrariness and even terror. So in this conception, law has been completely eviscerated to give way to pure arbitrary violence. And I'm not totally in agreement with this, because this supposes that there is such a thing as a pure law that would not be touched by violence. And I'm going to say a few words about this. I think that the Code de l'Indigénat points us in a different direction. Rather than being outside of the law, the Code, which after all was law, I mean, it was voted by the French Parliament, so it belongs to the body of French law. The Code might be better read as an exception within the law, following Agamben, something that is not absolutely without relation to the rule. Even if this relation is defined only negatively in Agamben, the rule applies to the exception in no longer in planning, in withdrawing from it. So you see the exception when the law doesn't apply. You can see both the exception and the law in this discrepancy, in this décalage. In that sense, le Code de l'Indigénat is a perfect exception. It is a law within which some basic legal principles are indefinitively suspended to make place for violence. This, I think, gets us a little closer, not very much maybe, but a little closer, at least for tonight, to a better understanding of the function of law in colonial situations, far from being a mask for violence or an ex post legitimation, and after the fact legitimation for violence. It enables it, it makes it possible. It opens a space for violence. These rather abstract considerations seem to have taken us quite far from the question of the subject, or even the colonial subject. But not too far, I think. Since, as I said, the code was an essential part of the everyday experience of the native populations in Algeria and elsewhere. Understanding how it made place for and enabled a form of legal violence is thus essential to assess this experience and beyond forms of subjectivity in at least three ways, I think. The first one, and maybe that's the most obvious and most classical, the first form of subjectivity is the affirmation of a collective political consciousness that has been very well documented by historians of nationalism, and especially of Algerian nationalism. There is no doubt that the arbitrariness of colonial rule constantly provoked reactions in which Algerian reactions appeared. This is true actually from the very beginning of the conquest, before the 1844 Ordinance of Bugeaud, before the special powers, before the Code de l'Indigénat. In 1833, Hamdan Hoxha, a learned member of the Algiers administrative and economic elite who had traveled to Europe and who had read Benjamin Constant, bitterly criticized the violence of the conquests by referring to the principles of political liberalism, which, interestingly enough, he compared to the main tenets of Algerian law. So he basically said in a publication that was actually written in Arabic, and translated into French immediately. That was basically a letter to the king and to the regency. He wrote this text in Arabic and was translated into French, and the Arabic manuscript is lost, and we have only the French version. But he says, I found that these principles, the principles of liberty, which provide the basis for representative and independent government, I found these principles were similar to the fundamental principles of our legislation. So this is someone who affirmed that the foundation of the Code d'Algeria, that is the impossibility for Muslims to understand to understand the open law, to understand the separation of power, is actually an inept principle to work from. A very important text in the tradition of Algerian nationalism, early and very important text. One find, obviously, other calls to universal legal principles in the late 19th century. As has been largely documented by historians, the implementation of the code was the occasion of much protests, led by the elite of young Algerians who had been educated in French schools and claimed civil liberties and political rights. They found many allies in France in the group of indigénophiles, a whole group of both academic scholars and politicians who presented themselves as lovers of natives, indigénophiles, and they used each renewal of the law and the code in the parliament to criticize the arbitrariness of colonial rule and ask for justice. Obviously, this mobilization was at the core of post-World War I requests for more political rights for Algerians. When, for example, that's an example that you may know, Emir Khaled wrote in his famous letter to US President Wilson that a description of arbitrary rule, and in which the Code de l'Indigénat was really front and center as the main example of what arbitrary colonial rule was. And he says, under a so-called republican regime, the largest part of the population is ruled by special laws, the Code de l'Indigénat, that would shame even barbarians. So that Emir Khaled writing to Wilson in 1990. But the colonial archives are also full of traces that indicate that the notion of arbitrariness had spread far beyond the circles of Francophone elites. Legal appeals to the highest French administrative court repeatedly denounced such abuse of power. And so there is a process in French administrative law, or in French society if you want, that you can appeal to an administrative court if you're unhappy with any form of public authority, and the highest level of those courts is still the Conseil d'État, and you find actually many complaints and recourse for abuse of power in the Conseil d'État by Algerians, also in the late 19th century. So people who use the channels of French administrative law to contest French colonial law. In addition to that, you can find hundreds of petitions to either the governor or to French Parliament mentioning arbitrariness. So here I have this petition from 1912. It's an anonymous petition that mentions the arbitrariness, or its Arabic equivalent. I had someone helping me with this, to the government. One could add that beyond these verbalized forms of contestation, there was a continent of illegal practices, from the dozens or the hundreds of rebellions that punctuated Algerian history to everyday illegalisms, which de facto both contested and reinforced the arbitrariness of the Indigénat. So that's on one hand the contestation, the resistance, if you want, either in words or in practice. But beyond this very well-known trajectory of production of political subjectivity, which is basically the narrative of nationalism, I believe that the Code de l'Indigénat has participated in two other ways to the making of the colonial subject. First, the imperative of security and colonial order had produced a constant need to better define who was a threat, and thus who was an indigène. The necessity to legally define who was going to be subjective to arbitrary rule was central in defining the indigène, not the other way around. So what I'm saying here, that violence comes first as a producer of categories, not the other way around. Take the story of Joseph Jean-Baptiste Denis, who petitioned against being subjected to indigenous law. and to the Code de l'Indigénat. In 1903, the Algiers Appeals Court considered this case and noted that the Indigénat applied to crimes, I quote, exclusively imputable to Muslim natives and Muslim foreigners. But Denis, while born of a Muslim mother and father, had been baptized in a French church, in a Catholic church. He had converted. Accordingly, he refused to be judged as a Muslim native. The Algiers court rejected his case on the ground that, I quote, it is manifest that the term Muslim does not have a purely faith-based meaning, but rather designates individuals of Muslims' origins who have not acquired French citizenship and thus have maintained their Muslim personal status, le statut personnel musulman. Their adherence or not to the Mahometan faith is beside the point. So here you have a process that is quite well known by legal theories, process of the production of a legal fiction. Here, the category of Christian, Muslim, native, the indigène, musulman, chrétien. By doing this, by forging these categories, this decision obviously reminds us of the vast capacity of law to produce fictions. But of course, fictions with very, very material effects. It also indicates that the production of categories of people, including subjects, was largely an effect of a regime of violence. Finally, a last important dimension of the Code de l'Indigénat is that it worked as a set of norms for colonial administrators too. I don't have the time to develop this here, but far from being given carte blanche to senseless acts of violence, unlike what Greg, I think, has tried to say, administrators were constrained by the code. They had to file weekly reports to justify their condemnation. They were asked to explain any sudden rise in penalties, and were in turn constantly they were constantly asking their peers and superiors if they were doing the right thing. To a large extent, the code allowed the central administration to keep control of a poorly trained colonial administrative corps. Administrators at the time, at least in the last third of the 19th century, the civil administrators had often no previous knowledge of law or of Arabic, and they were sent alone to control thousands of natives, assisted by a few locals. To a large extent, the archives revealed that the code game was not only a way to frame the interactions between administrators and indigènes, but also a tool, a way for administrators to decipher the social situation, the very new and bizarre social situation in which they were plunged at the time, by mostly after the passage to civil power after 1870. So as you see, this is very, 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 very much a work in progress. Again, this is the first time I'm speaking for that. And I'm not sure I have a set conclusion at this point. It may be, except a very few words on how we tend to analyze violence. As you know, maybe more in France than here, or maybe more in a social scientific tradition I'm familiar with, the analysis of violence has often tried to go beyond pure phenomenological descriptions by distinguishing between a form of physical and symbolic violence, following to some extent Pierre Bourdieu. What I hope to have shown here is that analyzing the relationship between law and violence allows us to go beyond this dichotomy and to understand the physical effects of symbolic violence, leading perhaps to a renewed value on textual analysis. Thank you very much.
I have a question about the 1865 text. There was a reference to the statut personnel Israeli. What was meant by that?
For the Israelites, for the Jews, the same for the Muslims. So basically everything was called the statut personnel belonged to what we call in French le droit civil, that is all the laws, which is not that is civil law, that's not the exact translation, but that's everything that concerns the individuals, his family, the question of inheritance and filiation. So the statute personnel, everything that concerns basically the individual in his relationship with his family and his property, his properties. So the statute personnel is ready, I mean that up until 1870, until when the Jews became French citizens. Jews in Algeria had a specific statute personnel. They had specific judges. They were judged according to mosaic law, quote unquote. And I'm saying quote unquote because it was, to a large extent, a colonial invention. It was, it was not exactly the way that the very fluid and dynamic way people used to be judged before, judged before 1830. But they were under a specific, law for private matters. And for example, polygamy was authorized by mosaic law, so we had a lot of Jews who were very, very upset. They wrote petitions to the French Parliament in 1870 because they had to give up their wives. I'm sorry?
Some of their wives, not all of them.
No, they could keep one. Actually, they didn't have to. It's only they could not marry more, basically. It was not retroactive. But there were lots of issues with that, with polygamy. Polygamy being in the French colonial imagination a central marker of difference, of legal difference. So polygamy is often an argument that is being used by the colonial elite and by colonial jurists to say we can't give citizenship to these people, we can't give them, full the full gamut of rights because they belong to, they are rigid, they are ruled by a Muslim law. I'm sorry, this is horrible. And the central symbolic, the most important symbol of that is polygamy.
Good question. Oh, sorry. Thank you, first of all. Extremely, very rich and very, very generative. I have a question about the loop you make back to subjectivity at the end, and how we might think about this, because it seems to me that there is this problematic, and you show very nicely how it's a certain incommensurability with intellectual history that we have. And there is this sort of hyper-legality that produces something quite different. And then you have these two or three forms of political subjectivity, the collective political consciousness first, and then the second one you said, this kind of this definition of the category. My question is that these seem to be, and I'm saying this as someone who's very interested in how this thought might travel to a colonial context, seem to be a kind of subjectivity that's formed as a sort of recoil or a kind of resistance to a form of authority, not an identification with authority as truth or the kind of inherent justness or goodness of authority, which is much more the kind of sort of genealogical or historical line we get with Balibar at least, and also with Foucault to a degree. Of course, the part of it is citizenship more in Balibar, but the other part is the Christian pastoral, which is also absent.
The what?
The Christian pastoral,
yeah.
the transcendental voice of the Christian God. So my question, is in a sense, what kind of subjectivity then are we talking about here when we talk about the subjectivity that comes out of this native code at the end of this entire process? Is it still analogous? Is it still sort of contiguous with the subjectivity that we get in French political thought, which I think is very important? I think that double bind is crucial. How does it travel?
Okay, there are two things. First of all, I was trying to address the question that the students were, asking of me. I don't, and I think there was some kind of, there was a resonance, the idea of the colonial subject with my work, but I don't, as I said, this tradition, which I know actually, I know because I've studied it until when I was in France. This is a tradition that doesn't resonate very much in when I'm in the archive. So it is, as I said, I don't think in those terms, let's say, and I don't think in those terms really because I don't see see it in that context because it is, as I said, a more pure form of subjection, of assujettissement than in the liberal context of French society of the 19th century. So when you have no rights, it seems very difficult to, absolutely no political rights. It seems difficult to have, or no space to, for a long time at least, to publicly voice your discontent. It is difficult to imagine a form of political subjectivity. And so I'm saying that, and I'm also saying I'm cheating, because when I was writing, I said, oh my gosh, no, that's not. And I'm very glad that you saw that. It's enabled me to think this much more. When I was writing this, it is after all. Speaking about all these people who write those petitions, it is not the same subjectivity, I think, that Foucault refers to when he speaks about being tied to your identity or being tied, like this process of reflection of the self. It is not the same thing because first of all, these people represent really a tiny elite. That's also what I'm trying to say. So, I mean, this gets us into a enormous, historiographical continent of thinking about the subaltern, and the voice of the subaltern, the ways in which the subaltern can speak or not speak, I'm obviously struggling with that. So as I said, it's I see the tension here. I see the tension. I don't have an answer at this point. I was a little some form of I was cheating a little with this, that I was not trying to. I could have done more in terms of the discussions and for me, as an historian, the proof of the archives. The sense that I need to find more of those. I need to work more. You know what I mean? I need to find more texts. I think this is really the beginning of something, and I need to get much more of that to be able to use the words that people use, and then get better. Okay, we have a couple more questions. Professor Duguin, sorry. Yes, Professor Duguin.
I have a question. I guess it has to do with your perception of the genealogy of this kind of legal regime. If you're going to speak about it as an exception within, what do you think that comes out of as a legal model? Mm-hmm. I mean, you can imagine in Algeria many different kinds of legal regime being instituted, and certainly there were colonial precedents. Mm-hmm. In the old colonies, mm-hmm. different kinds of law. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was curious. I hadn't really thought about this before. That the indigenous code coming out of the naval code, mm-hmm. for example, and how you think about that. I was also struck by the motivation for the criminalization under the indigenous code of non-payment of taxes. Yeah. Which really anticipates, they anticipate that that's going to be an act of political resistance, which of course, Gandhi, this whole program of non-payment of taxes. Mm-hmm. And was there a lot of colonial political non-payment of taxes prior to this moment? So I guess there are questions about, working backwards a little bit.
Yeah. That's actually, the project is really, normally it's open to each one. So what I'm really interested is in the genesis of this, the genealogy and the genesis of this. One of, there are many of them, I can't give justice to all of them right now. It's obvious that the main one maybe is actually terror, law during the terror, so there are people placed outside of the law, the émigrés, who are, hors la loi. So this space for exceptional law within the law is something that comes from the revolution, and especially the moment of the terror. The sequestration, for example, is something that was used against émigrés, and actually people, as an historian, what I'm interested in is that not only genealogies, but how people use genealogies, and people at the time in 1880 made reference to the revolution, and they also make reference to the French, the Code Maritime, and the idea that actually on the sea you are outside of the law. On the sea it's extraterritoriality. So there is a need for there is a possibility for specific disciplinary law on a boat with a captain who has all authority. That's why it's used for that. That's an analogy that is being used by the redactors of the code. And the other thing is obviously the code noir. And one of the very interesting things that has not been studied, I think, is, and that's something I'm very interested in. I've been working on the question of the suppression of slavery in Algeria. That's another part of this project. I think of your character. There is, as far as I can tell, I'm sure, and again, I need to spend more time on this, a very strong connection between le code noir and this kind of codification, and the abolition of slavery is actually a central moment for defining the space of, for the status of the Indian. For example, in 1848, in the Commission pour l'abolition de l'esclavage, there is a question about what are we going to do with slaves in Algeria. The movement in France is very, very clear. No free people who are not citizens. That Ashoshio says, I don't want a hybrid of citizens. I don't want half citizens, quarter citizens. I want full citizens. So the very day that in the old colonies, mostly in the Caribbean and in Réunion, the very day the slaves are freed, they also become citizens. There is no space, there is no time, there is no lapse in between freedom and full citizenship. People say, we actually do have a lot of slaves in Algeria. We're also going to abolish slavery in Algeria. What do we do with those slaves? Are we giving them citizenship? And Churchill says, no, we are not, because giving them citizenship would give them more rights, obviously, than their former masters, the native of Algeria. So we can't do that. We're not going to give citizenship universally to all former slaves. And those people, he says, are indigènes. Are indigent, and so he put them in a different space. So in those debates, and in the debates preceding the abolition of slavery, and in the debate on the Code de l'Ingénieur, I think there is a genealogy to be found. Although people in the 1870s never mentioned the Code Noir, which is a little bit there are certainly analogies. Yes.
Great, so thank you. I really enjoyed this paper, and I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your argument, especially the argument you make with respect to the historiography and the code. I'm not going to butcher it, the code. Yeah, subject you all to my French. So I agree with you that the code opens up space for violence, and I like the idea that it might limit violence. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could explore that by thinking about excess, especially who is accused of excess internally within the colonial administration. Mm-hmm. Are they punished? Mm-hmm. What happens to those who transgress the code, the internal code of how you impose the code, inflict the code? Mm-hmm. Because I think if you can prove that people are punished for exceeding their power, then you have a strong argument for saying that it does limit it.
Yes, absolutely. So there are administrators who are denounced by their population for one of the very, very common problems that is underlined by the natives is the private use of the code. So as I said, the code more and more is going to replace prison or jail time by days of work. So people don't go. So the code basically is the administrator sees an indigent who does something that is defined in one of those lists, and without due process, without any investigation, send them to prison up to at the time up to 10 years in prison, I think, or 5 days of prison, because it changes all the time. And then it's going to be changed into days of labor. And so what we develop in terms of an abuse of power is the administrator using these people to work on their house, to build their house and that. So that's a very important reason for the administrator to be chastised by the higher labor administration, but because this is a privatization of the code, not because there was a real abuse of power. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like it was arbitrary. The problem was it was a privatization of the use of the code in a way. These people should have been put on like public, to the public code. One of the things that is fascinating, I didn't have time to get into that, is that actually a lot of this is actually administered by natives. So a lot of the the administrator have auxiliaries, and those auxiliaries are, called kaid, or depends on the places, but they are actually natives who actually implement the code. And most of the, so that makes a very, this is a complicated space. It's not a, it's not a very uniform, easy, Manichaean opposition. So the most of the abuse that are denounced are abuse done by native auxiliaries of French administrators. So that's what you find at the top of the chain, at the top of the pyramid. You see that. So not because they're making more, but because those are the ones who are punished by the French administration. It's easier to punish them. But there is work there is some work that was done on the notion of abus de pouvoir, abuse of power in Algeria. It's slightly different, where it was mostly about prevarication, but yes, one of the things that is complicated to say, yes, that thing that open violence also limited it. This code was a way of, in very, very bizarre ways, a way of actually limiting arbitrariness.
We have time for one more question.
I was just wondering, I find it very interesting. My background is more South Asian, but how could French have done it differently? How could they have done it differently?
That's not a question to, it's always a good question to ask, because we don't want to look at things as, there's no necessity in history. We could look at other choices,
was it imperative that they do it the way they did? In a sense, that's what the question is.
That's a very, very good question. So one of the things that I found fascinating is the whole concept of security. When did sécurité become so important? If you look at the French recent political history, the notion of sécurité is on, is everywhere. So the extreme right in France, Le Pen and all that, they have equated sécurité with order, with political stability. So sécurité is really a central concept, or has been a central concept of the recent political life. So I was interested in that, in the presence of this word in these archives, and I looked back and looked at the 50s, in the Mitidja, in the very fertile land around Algiers, and all the administrators I've looked at lots and lots of administrators' reports. That's how I spent my summer. And they said everything's fine. So in the 50s, everything's fine. Everything is, everybody's happy. There is the indigene are collaborating with us. We have that's the 50s, and 20 years later, everybody's up in arms saying, "Oh, there is a very, very, very strong sense of insecurity." Meanwhile, one very, very important event is 1871, a massive, massive insurrection in Catalonia, which has really, really scared the French very deeply. So that was a very, we looked at, things being very threatening, but there were actually a lot of smaller revolts and rebellions throughout the history of the French presence in Algeria in the 19th century. So that's one of the things that, in a way, it has some kind of, not contingent, but it is not necessary. You're right. In the 50s, there is both the idea that the government needs to have special powers, so it needs to practice internment or use collective funds, all these things that are kind of used as a way of imposing colonial powers. But at the same time, as I said, on the ground, everything looks fine and peaceful. So it's, yes, it's not an absolute necessity. As I said, one of the things that interests me most, and in a way this is a slightly at odds, I think, with some of the cultural analysis that has gone in the critique of Orientalism, is that there is no structural a priori, opposition between the French and the indigene in 1830. It's not that people arrive in Algeria with they don't know what to do. A very set, not completely, a very set of, and obviously they have cultural representations, but how they're going to characterize, qualify legally the indigene, how to, what to do with them. It's actually the product of local relations of power as much as the consequence of cultural representation.